Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Cross Current. Good to see you. My name's Fraser. I'm the senior pastor. Would you take out your church programs? Please look like these. Turn to the center pages. And if you missed those, there are people coming right now who can give you a copy. And the verses will appear in the notes and on the screens. This is week 3 of a series called Famous Last Words. And we're looking at the 7 last words of Jesus on the cross as we move towards Easter. The first word from the cross was the word of forgiveness when Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And we looked at what forgiveness is about. The second word from the cross last week, Pastor Tim took us on the word of assurance, which is when Jesus said to the thief on the cross, he said, "I assure you today you will be with me in paradise." And we talked about how you can be certain that you go to heaven when you die. And if you missed those messages, you can catch them up on our website, crosscurrent.org. But this morning, we're going to look at the third word of Jesus from the cross. It's the word of love. And this is a word that Jesus says to his mother Mary, who's standing at the foot of the cross, and to his best friend, who is John the disciple. Now, let me explain the scene. Jesus has been up all night. He went through 6 trials, 3 religious trials, 3 Roman trials. All of them were illegal. And after those trials, if you know the story, Pontius Pilate handed him over that he be beaten. And if you read the stories as they're accounted to us, it tells us how they spat on him, they pulled out his beard. At one point, they even covered his eyes and they punched him and asked him to prophesy, "Which one of us do you think it was who punched you?" Then they scourged him. Now, a scourging is kind of like a whipping, but it's different, because with a scourge, they used a thing called the cat of 9 tails. And Jesus got 40 stripes with the cat of 9 tails. So Jesus had, what's the math, 280 abrasions, bruises, or cuts on his back as he went to the cross. By the way, in those days, people would often die from the scourging alone. It was quite rare that someone would be scourged and then also crucified, because the scourging was so awful. So Jesus went through that. Then they took Jesus and they made a crown out of thorns and they jammed it onto his head. They forced him to carry his wooden cross up a hill to his place of execution, whereby, as you all know, they nailed him by his hands and feet to the cross, and there was a crowd shouting insults at him the whole time. And in this scene, everybody's left him. Indeed, almost all of the disciples have run away. You know the 12 guys? Almost all of them have gone. There's one called John, the beloved disciple. We think this is Jesus' closest friend. He's the only one that shows up, because the others have run away for fear that they too will be arrested. But who does show up at the cross are the women. And when you read the original stories, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we call those the Gospels. They're like the witness accounts of the life of Jesus. And when you piece it together, there were a number of women there. There were at least 4, maybe as many as 6. But there were 4 women that we know of at the foot of the cross, along with the one disciple, John. And in this scene, with all that has happened, Jesus says the following words. It's the word of love, and we're going to use John's version, John chapter 19, verse 25 and following. Read it closely with me. It says, "Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary," so that's another Mary, "the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene." So there are at least 3 Marys. And it says, "When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, 'Dear woman, here is your son.' And to the disciple, 'Here is your mother.' And from that time on, this disciple took her into his home." Now, tradition tells us that Mary would live another 12 years. That's not in the Bible, but church tradition says that she lived 12 more years, and that for the rest of her life, it was John the disciple who cared for her. Now, you remember the Christmas story that Mary was married to Joseph, where we understand that Joseph had died some years prior to this already. And so John, this disciple, tradition tells us, cared for Mary, the mother of Jesus, for the rest of her life. Look at these very simple words. Mother, here is your son, and to his disciple, here is your mother. It all sounds pretty simple, I guess, but there are profound implications when you understand what is happening here, because what this shows us is the real heart of God, doesn't it? That heart of Jesus, the God in flesh who is compassion and tenderness and love and mercy, even at this moment, the worst of all his moments. So I want to talk this morning about what do we learn about Jesus from this, and how do we learn to love the way that Jesus loves in this way? And there are going to be four main things for you to write in your notes. The first is this. Number one, if we're going to learn to love like Jesus, firstly, I must learn to take care of my family. I guess that's the most obvious observation in the story. But love is something that you do. It's not just something that you say, it's a choice, it's an action. And here, in the middle of all Jesus' pain, right? He's hanging on the cross, dying. He's had the scourge. He's got the crown of thorns. All of this. He does three things for his mother. I want to give you 3 sub-points. And these are the same 3 things that you must do to take care of your family. Write these in. The first one is this. We notice that love pays attention. It pays attention. And that's what Jesus does. He pays attention to his grieving mother who's standing there at the foot of the cross, right? Jesus is dying on the cross, and yet he ignores all the crowd who are mocking him. They were shouting insults at him. They were saying, if you're really the Son of God, save yourself. They were saying, oh, he's calling on Elijah to come and help him. People were spitting at him. He's lying. He's up there derobed. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. He's in pain. And he ignores all of that. And he gives his attention to his mother. You know, attention is one of the greatest gifts that you can give somebody. Why is that the case? Why is attention more important than money or things? The reason that attention is the greatest thing you can give someone is because when you give someone your attention, you give them your time. And when you give someone your time, you're giving them your life. Right? Because you can always get more money, you can always get more stuff, but you can never get time back. And so when you pay attention to someone, when you look them in the eyes and you listen, you're communicating to them, you matter. You are valuable. You are worthy. You're treating people with dignity and respect when you pay them attention. Of course, the inverse is true. When you don't pay people attention, what are you saying? You're saying that they're not important and not valuable to us. You know, when you pay attention to a child and your family, you respect them. When you pay attention to your wife or your husband, you respect them. One of the reasons, by the way, in the story that the woman could get so close to the cross was because, as probably you know, in those days, in the culture of that time, where over 2,000 years ago, nobody paid attention to women. Women were chattel, they were property. And if you were an unmarried woman or if you were a widow, you were lower than the lowest. So the Roman soldiers who were around the cross at the time paid no attention to the women standing at the cross, and that's why these Marys, and particularly his mother, was able to get there. But Jesus, on the other hand, this is what's so revolutionary about the life of Jesus, is Jesus treated women differently. Jesus always elevated the status of women. You see, it's easy to look at the Bible, and critics will look at it and say, well, look at that, the way it plays down women, the way it mistreats women. Yeah, that was the history of humanity. But what's incredible about Jesus in the Bible is the way that he was counter to the culture and that he elevated the status of women in his day. And here it is, the disciples are fled, but the women come near, the Roman soldiers pay no attention, and Jesus is honoring the 5th commandment that he would have learned as a child. Remember the 10 commandments? The 5th one says this, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. All you parents know it, because you've tried to drill it into your kids. It says, honor your father and mother. By the way, there is no statute of limitations on this command. In other words, you don't honor your parents as long as you live at home. That's not what it says. It doesn't say you honor your parents as long as you're single. That's not what it says. It doesn't say you honor your parents as long as they're nice to you. In fact, it doesn't even say honor your mother and father as long as they're alive. It's honor your mother and father as long as you're alive. Your parents might be passed on by now, but you've still to honor them in your life. And Jesus, hanging on this cross with all that's going on, takes seriously this command that he is to honor his mother. You say, well, Fraser, you don't know my mom and dad. No, I don't. But you know what? It's not so much the matter of what they've done. Maybe your parents were not great parents. Maybe you had a hard time. Maybe you're having a hard time. But we have to honor our parents not because of what they've done or not done, but because of the position they hold and because of the role that God used to bring you into life. And so you show honor to their position. My question to you is, who is there in your family that you need to pay more attention to? If love pays attention, like when dad's sitting, maybe reading the paper and the little kid comes up and, pulls down the paper and says, look at me, Daddy. What is she saying? She's saying, I want you to pay attention to me. Why? Because love pays attention. And that's what Jesus did. He paid attention to his mother. Here's the second thing love does, right? This, and love provides for needs. In many ways, when you think of these phrases of Jesus, this is almost like his last will and testament, isn't it? These are like the last words that he's going to speak before he dies. And in his last will and testament, what is Jesus' final earthly task? What is the last job that he has to accomplish here? Providing for his mother. Really? What? You see, in fact, Joseph wasn't really his father anyway, right? Because God was his father. You know that whole thing, the Immaculate Conception? I actually think it was an immaculate contraption. Contraption? Conception? Never mind. Joseph wasn't really his father. But Mary was his mother. And Jesus knows that Mary is getting older, that she's poor, that she's a widow because Joseph is dead, and that as Jesus is dying, she needs to be cared for. And as I mentioned, in those days, the widows were the lowest. And so in the middle of his pain, hanging on the cross, Jesus looks down and he says, John, I want you to take care of my mom. Isn't that amazing? This is your new son. And Jesus knew that by putting them together, Mary and John, he's creating a relationship for both of them. Jesus had nothing else to give his mother. As far as we know, he had no inheritance. Jesus had no money. He didn't own a property to leave her. He didn't even now have any clothes. He had this one piece of clothing, but as you read the story, it tells us that the Roman soldiers had taken it, and because it was such a nice thing, they decided rather than ripping it up, they cast some dice to see who would get to keep it. So Mary wasn't even getting the cloak off his back. So what does he do? Better than giving her things, he gave her the best gift possible, which was care. We talked about attention, but what about care? What about care? This is your son. And what does that have to do with us, right? Well, the Bible tells us that we also have to provide for the needs of our family. Let's look what Paul tells Timothy in the book of 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 3. It reads this: show respect for widows who really are alone. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, they should learn first to carry out their religious duties toward their own family, and in this way repay their parents and grandparents, because this is what pleases God. You want to please God? Love starts at home. That's what he says. Your love and loving like Jesus doesn't start on a missions trip. Love and loving Jesus doesn't start at a church doing your ministry. It doesn't even start in your neighborhood. He says where love starts that pleases God is in your own family and with the people that sometimes you don't always get along with. This is how you please God. And what does he specifically mention? Taking care of our elderly parents and our elderly grandparents. He goes on in verse 8 to say something even stronger. He says, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, then he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That's pretty clear, right? That's how important love is. That love starts in the home with our family, and that it involves providing for our needs, for our husband's needs, our wife's needs, our children's needs, but also back up the way that we care for our parents and grandparents as they get older. We don't leave them to the care of the state. We don't leave them to someone else's care, but that we love and care for them ourselves. So we said love provides for needs. The third thing that love does is it protects people's emotions. You know, I really believe that here we have one of the most tender scenes in the scripture. Mary, the mother of Jesus, she is watching her son be tortured. And here's John, his best friend, standing there helpless while his friend is in agony. And John and Mary are miserable. They're overwhelmed with grief. They're totally brokenhearted. I mean, this is an incredible scene. And I want you to try, if you can, to imagine the emotional baggage, the pain and suffering that Mary has had to go through, not just now, but her entire life, simply by being Jesus' mother. Let me take you through a quick survey of her life, right? In the first place, she has this unexplainable pregnancy, right? You know? And so she has to go to her parents and her friends in her hometown and say, I'm pregnant, but honest, I promise I'm a virgin. Yeah, right. Oh, and by the way, this baby that I'm carrying, it's really the Son of God. Sure. Sure it is, Mary. Would you believe that? No, nobody did. And so the illegitimacy of this child clouds her pregnancy and his entire childhood. Then we're told that once the baby was born, that on the 8th day, Mary and Joseph took the baby along to the temple to present him before God. And we read of an elderly prophet called Simeon. And Simeon takes the child, and we read how he says, wow, I need to tell you some things about this child. This is a special child. And he begins to prophesy some things. But here's what he says to Mary. He said, and Mary, this child will pierce your heart also. So imagine that after this cloud of illegitimacy, you go to God's temple and you're told, by the way, you're going to suffer. This child's only 8 days old. You've just had your kid, and you're told that you're going to have suffering your whole life. We go forward, and then there's a story. Jesus turns 30 years old, and he comes on his first public ministry, and he begins preaching, and he turns water into wine, and he heals a leper, and he raises a dead man, and he does all these incredible miracles, and he decides to go back to his own hometown. And he goes back to Nazareth, and he does a couple of miracles, but guess what happens? The people that he grew up with think he's crazy, and we're told that they tried to throw him off a cliff. The people that in his town that he would have known. Now, you imagine being Mary. How do you go back to being friends with the people and the other mothers of the friends who tried to throw your son off a cliff? And so Mary has had all this to deal with all through her life. And now here she is standing at the foot of this cross, watching her son bleed out. And listening to other people mock at him and spit on him and call him names. And this is what Mary has to see. By the way, I forgot a part of the story. What about the part where Jesus is 2 years old? Remember that part? And King Herod decides that in order to get rid of this coming Messiah, he's going to kill all the babies 2 years and younger. And we're told Mary and Joseph had to flee to Egypt. They were refugees and they had to flee. So we've got this illegitimacy, we've got the accusation of others, we've got 2 years old having to flee to another country because they're trying to kill your kid. We've got your friend's sons trying to throw your son off a cliff. And now we got him crucified on a cross. Simeon was right, wasn't he? He will pierce your heart also. Wow. And Jesus looks down and he pays attention to her. And he provides for her needs by bringing along John. And he comforts her, acknowledging her emotional pain. What about you? The Bible says this in Proverbs 17, verse 17. It says, friends love through all kinds of weather, and families stick together in all kinds of trouble. How many people know there are all kinds of trouble? All kinds of trouble. And what this is saying is if we're going to love like Jesus, you got to do, I like to say it like this, you've got to show up, you've got to stand up, and you've got to speak up. You see, families don't disappear when one of the others is being crucified. When someone in your family is going through the season of crucifixion, and listen, we all go through them, then families are supposed to show up and stand up and speak up. Do you stand up for your kids when a little bit of trouble starts happening? When your kids are in bother? Yeah, you're not pleased. You're not happy with what's happened, but do you stand by them? Do you show up in their life, stand by them and speak for them? You know, I remember one of the greatest things that really just touched my heart. I was about 8 or 9 years old. I had this other kid. I grew up in a pretty poor part of town in a high-rise flat, community housing. And it was a little ghetto, and there were gangs. And I think I've told some of you, when I was 10 years old, there was a man murdered right in front of our door. It was a great place in some ways, and a crazy place in others. But I remember I had a nemesis. You know how there's always a nemesis. And I had this guy. I won't name him, but his name was David Blakely. And he and I, we just fought all the time, and I felt like he was bullying me, and sometimes he chased me home from school. It was terrible things. And so one day, I decided I'd had enough, and when I saw he was coming, I picked up a rock, and I just threw it at him, and it hit him bad, and he was bleeding. And so I panicked, and I ran back home and straight up the flat and into my house. Well, about half an hour later, there was a big chap at the door, and it was him and his mom. Him and his mom came to my door. Now, I was guilty. I did it. I know I did it. I threw the stone, it hit him. He was bleeding. I had no excuse. My mom went to the door, but you know what? My mom stood up for me. Even though she knew that I did it, and no one denied that I did it, but she stood up for me, and she let that woman know just what David Blakely had been doing to me in recent times, and they had a little confrontation at the door, little intense fellowship. But I tell you what, I grew a foot taller because I knew that my parent had my back. Is that you? Do you show up? Do you stand up? And do you speak up? What about a word to husbands? Ephesians 5, verse 25. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up, sacrificed his life for her. Jesus is asked, how much do you love the church? And with his arms spread wide, he had them nailed in that position. He said, this much. This is how much I love the church, that I die for it. You know, I know people all the time, they get all upset because the Bible clearly teaches that a husband is to be the head of the home, right? People get all upset about that. They say, well, that's terrible. It doesn't work in today's world. It should be about equality. Listen, that's misunderstood. Are wives equal to husbands? Absolutely. Equality in value, of course. But the husband is called to lead. Now, how? Well, what does this verse say? Love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up. What's interesting is there is nowhere in the Bible that says a wife is to lay down her life for her husband. It says a husband has to lay down his wife for his wife. So when it says that the husband is the head of the home and that he's the leader, what does that really mean? It doesn't mean that he's the boss. It doesn't mean that he's the manipulator. It doesn't mean that he's the abuser of his position. It means that he gets to sacrifice the most. You go first, husband, and you pay the greater cost, and you lay down your life for them. So what's the first thing that we learned? And I spend the most time on point number 1. Is that we must care for our family. The second lesson from this story, number 2, is I must treat other believers as my family. If I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, that means that every other Christian, everybody else in this church, is my brother and sister. Now, you've probably heard the phrase, blood is thicker than water, and I think that's true. But there is a bond that is thicker even than blood. And that is the spiritual bond of brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. Why is that true? Because grace is greater than genetics. Your physical family that you have, your husband, wife, children, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and all the rest, is an institution for earth only. And what it is really is a model of the spiritual family of God, the triune God, and a model of the church. But what will last forever, listen, your physical family lasts as long as you're alive on earth, but your spiritual family lasts for eternity. Other Christians will be your brothers and sisters forever. I love that. You know, church members years ago used to call each other brother and sister. I think it'd be a good tradition to bring back. You know what I'm talking about? You know, for thousands of years they say, oh, there's Brother Jim. There's Brother John. There's Brother Tim. Oh, here's Sister Amanda and Sister Lisa. Because the Bible is clear we have to treat each other as family members. What's this? Again, we're in 1 Timothy chapter 5. I want you to circle some of these words. It says, do not rebuke an older man. This is in the church, right? Do not rebuke an older man, but appeal to him as your father. Circle the word father. It says, treat the younger men as brothers. Circle the word brothers. Treat the older women as mothers. Circle that word. And treat the younger women as sisters. Circle sisters. He's talking about in the church. And this is what family relationships are to be in the church. And in this church, Cross Current Church, we are supposed to be family. I've walked with the Lord about 18 years now, but there are men in this church, men on our leadership team who have known the Lord longer than me. And I consider them spiritual fathers. And I listen to them. And they give me advice. I have many, many spiritual brothers in this church who will give me advice. And I will listen to people who have come to me and said, Fraser, have you thought about this? Have you considered that? And I listen to my brothers. I have sisters in this church who say, have you considered it this way? Have you thought about it perhaps the way that a woman sees this issue? And I'd say, you know what? You're right. I didn't think of it that way. I have many spiritual sisters in this church. And maybe you don't realize this, but here's the responsibility if you're in this church, right? Are you ready? If you're a younger adult, part of your responsibility is to care for the older adults in this church by providing for their needs. And if you're in the older bunch, we're not going to set age numbers between whether you're older or younger. You decide for yourself. But if you're an older adult in the church family, you're commissioned and called by God to help mentor the younger adults in this family. Listen, those of you whose kids have grown up now, look at all these other young couples here trying to raise their kids. Help them. Help them. Romans 12:10 says, be devoted to each other like a loving family and excel in showing respect for each other. What does it mean, be devoted to each other? It means we stick together. Listen, if you hear somebody else in this church is in trouble, it is your duty to stick up for them and defend them and to be there for them. Because here's what, and you say, well, where are you getting this from the story? I'll tell you why. Because Jesus had 6 brothers and sisters. Now, some of you didn't know that. All right? But after Mary and Joseph got married, and after Jesus was born, they went on to have their own children. And so they're like the half-brothers and sisters of Jesus. They're even named in the Bible. One of them is James, in the book of James, right? There's a book in the Bible called James. That guy, James, is one of the half-brothers of Jesus. And so is the letter of Jude. But here's what's interesting. Where are they in this story? Nowhere. You know why? Because none of his brothers and sisters believed he was the Messiah until after the resurrection. So here's Jesus on the cross, and who does he leave his mother's care into? Because the Jewish law says that the oldest son had to provide for his elderly mother. Jesus is the oldest son. He is about to die on the cross. So who does he leave the care of his mother to? His 6 brothers and sisters? No. But to John. Why? Because John was the only one who was a believer. We are to treat other believers like family. Galatians 6:10 says this, whenever we have the opportunity to help people, we should do it. But we should give special attention to those who belong to the family of believers. See that? It says help anyone in need, but especially other Christians. Now, how do we give special attention to other people? Well, partly I think it's practical needs, right? Can I help you with your car? Can I help you with your lawn? Can I cook you a meal? Can we babysit for your kids? Would you like some clothes that don't fit my kids anymore? Would you like our old car seat or stroller? That's how we help one another, right? Galatians 6:2, share each other's troubles and problems. What does that mean? It means protect people's emotions. And in this way, you obey the law of Christ. Now, how do you do that one? How do you share troubles and problems of other people in the church? And there is only one way you can do it. Listen, you've got to be in a small group. You say, oh, here comes Fraser's sermon on small groups. Yeah, you've got to be in a small group. Got it? Good. There's my sermon. Why? Because you cannot give or receive emotional support in a crowd. You can't get the kind of emotional support right now. And you can't receive what you need right now. You've got to get in a small group. And conveniently, we're signing them up. And we have a free lunch on April the 2nd or whatever it is. There are 2 other things we learned. So we've talked about love for family, treating other believers as family. Number 3. The third thing we learn, if I'm going to love like Jesus, I must see other people's pain when I'm in pain. I don't just help people when things are going good in my life, but I help other people even when things stink in my life. Look at Jesus, right? Is things going well for Jesus right at this moment in the story? Things are not good. He is in excruciating pain. By the way, that's where the word comes from. Excruciating. That crux word in the middle is the word cross. Excruciating pain comes from crucifixion. He's struggling to breathe. As Tim alluded to last week, really when people died on the cross, it was because they couldn't breathe. And yet, even though he's in pain, his real focus is on someone else's pain. I'm not very good at this. I know that when I'm suffering, when I feel unwell, if I'm in hospital and have a surgery, if I'm at home vomiting up, I'm not really thinking, I wonder what the church is doing. I wonder how everyone at church is doing. That's not very natural for me. When I'm not well, when I'm suffering, when I'm pained, when I'm in grief, I really just think about myself. But not Jesus. Jesus, in this great pain, looks and sees that his mother is suffering and that his best friend is suffering. Philippians 2, chapter 5 tells us that your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. In other words, we're supposed to look around. And what's incredible about this is that one of the best ways to get out of your pain is to go help someone else in pain. Psychologists call this the helper's high. As long as you keep focusing on your own pain, you wallow in it and you get stuck. But when you say, yeah, I am in pain, but who else is there around me that's in an even worse situation than me? Maybe you're having relational difficulty. You say, well, who else is having relational difficulty? Let me go help them. Don't wallow in your pain. Use it to get out of your pain and to draw closer to God by going and focusing on someone else. Now, here's the key, listen, to getting over grief. Maybe you feel you're in a season of grief. You've lost something or someone or given up on a dream. And you feel like you're mourning. And that's a good thing. The Bible says, blessed are those who mourn. Grief is a good thing. But while you grieve, here's the key to getting out of it, is you must refocus. You must look around to something and somebody else and put your focus there. Jesus was in pain, but he still saw other people's pain. Don't think that because you're hurting, you can't help. And the fourth observation, number 4, I must meet other people's needs even when mine aren't met. Ooh. Really? You see, Jesus has this enormous emotional and spiritual need, doesn't he? He's hanging on the cross. Doesn't he have needs? Is he hanging there? Doesn't he have need? Of course he has needs, but his needs are not being met. And yet he makes sure that other people's needs are being met. You know, what's interesting is Jesus here is hanging on the cross, and he doesn't say, this is not what he says, I'm sorry, but I'm in too great of a pain. I can't help anyone right now. Jesus doesn't say, I'm sorry, but my purpose is too important to help anybody else. I've got to focus on what I'm trying to do here. That's not what he says, does he? I want you to follow me on the logic of this. The most important task, the most important job, the most important assignment, the most important goal that there has ever been in the history of humanity was what Jesus was doing at this very moment, because he was paying for the sins of every person, right? You with me? Nothing done ever before or since is more important than what he's doing in this moment as he takes the sin of mankind upon himself. So you would think that if there was ever a time to say, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit busy right now. I have other things on my mind. I have a lot on my plate. I can't quite draw my attention away from my purpose in order to help somebody else. So do not tell me that you cannot pay attention to your family because you've got this deal that you have to close. And that you have to work all these extra hours for this contract to be fulfilled, so you cannot be in a small group. If you cannot pay attention to your family, if you cannot be in church or in a small group, then you are closing the wrong deals and you are fulfilling the wrong contracts, because that is not what God put you here on earth to do. This is all about relationships. Life is about learning to love before we go to heaven. Don't tell me your purpose is greater than Jesus, because he was fulfilling the ultimate thing, and yet what does he see? The need of his mother, the need of his friend. Romans 15 verse 2 in the Message says, each one of us needs to look after the good of the people around us and asking ourselves, how can I help? So when was the last time you asked that question? How can I help? Husbands, when was the last time you asked your wife? How can I help? Wives, when did you ask your husband? Probably about 5 minutes before we started service. When was the last time you asked your children? When was the last time you asked your elderly parent, how can I help? Why am I telling you this? Because much of life is looking for Jesus disguised in hurting people around us. That's where you find Jesus, in the eyes of people nearby who hurt. Romans 12:13, this is our last scripture. You guys can come up. It says, when God's children are in need, be the one to help them out. Get into the habit of inviting guests home for dinner. That sounds good to me. Or if they need lodging for the night. So here's what I want you to do. I want to give you an assignment. I don't want you to just leave here and say, boy, that was a good message. I want you to do something about this message. I want you to go out and I want you to find somebody between now and Easter and help them in some way. Help them in a physical way. Help someone with their car. Help someone with buying groceries. Find a single mom struggling with kids and offer to cook them a meal each week. Find an old person in a senior home who gets no visits and adopt that person, take them on a trip, day out. Do something practical to help someone between now and Easter. Or invite them to your small group. And then on Easter Sunday, ask them if they want to come to church. We'll help them in their physical ways and in their emotional ways. And on Easter Sunday, we'll help them seal their spiritual destiny. I want to challenge you to accept this over these next few weeks. Because Jesus, even in his pain, saw that there was need around him. This is the word of love. Let's bow our heads and pray. I want you to just pray this in your heart. You don't have to pray it out loud, but just pray this. Lord Jesus, I want to learn to love like you did. So help me to start with my own family. Show me that love pays attention. That love meets practical needs and that love protects other people's emotions. And then, Lord, take that and help me to do it with the church family too, to see other people as brothers and sisters and to look at other older believers as mothers and fathers in the faith and younger believers that I could mentor and help and encourage. Help me to share the problems and burdens of others in a small group, to both give and to receive. And even when I'm in pain, to realize that I can still help somebody else, that I don't have to be perfect. So give me the power to love others the way that you love others. Jesus, you're amazing. On that cross, in spite of all you faced, you still poured out for others. And even in small ways, help me to be the same. But mostly, I just want to be closer to you. I want to stand at the foot of the cross with John and with Mary. I want to be just like you. And I pray this in Jesus' name.